You do that. Let me introduce our next speaker. Jeff Hardin spoke here in 2000, and as you can see from the green handout that we have, Jeff has been teaching here at the UW for quite some time, and we love Jeff. We decided to give him the real easy question of what is science, actually. So at any rate, Jeff's going to go from now until 10:50 for anybody in the lobby or anything that needs. We'll give Jeff all his 45 minutes. So this is, why don't you welcome to the platform, Dr. Jeff Hardin.
Well, thank you, Chris. On the yellow handout, we were discussing whether color reflected character. I'm not sure. I'll leave you to judge, but it's really nice to be here, and it's nice to be a part of this seminar series. I'm really looking forward to the rest of the day. And by the way, all of us are looking forward to interacting with you, especially at lunch today. So we'll look forward to having a little one-on-one time there. Well, I've been given, in many ways, probably an unenviable task, and that's to try to talk about what is science, what are its limits, and how should we think about that as Christians in 45 minutes. And we can't hope, that's a hopeless task. And so I have very limited goals this morning. And to understand where I'm headed, I want to tell you a couple of stories about people that I know personally. As Chris has already mentioned, science and faith, often they're pitted against one another. That's true at the university, certainly, but it's also true here in a church like this one. And trying to understand the origins of that conflict and trying to see how rightly understanding science and rightly understanding what the Bible says about nature can diffuse that conflict. And that's what we want to address today. Now, why is it such a big issue? Well, let me tell you a couple of stories. The first involves a graduate student of mine, Tina. Tina's actually doing her PhD thesis defense next week. And when Tina first arrived at the university, she was not a Christian, but quickly became one in her first semester as a graduate student. And the church that she attends needed someone to teach Sunday school. And so Tina taught the 5th grade Sunday school class. And so Tina, being a good Sunday school teacher, trying to develop some rapport with the students, decided to ask them a question. Kids, if you could ask God any one question, what would it be? Pretty good one, huh? I'm not sure what I would say. And there were a wide range of responses. And then one very quiet, shy girl raised her hand, and she said, well, I'd ask him one thing. And Tina looked at the girl, puzzled, and said, well, what would you ask him? And the girl said, well, I'd ask him if it's true. And Tina said, well, if what's true? And then the little girl said, well, I'd ask him if it's true that all scientists are going to hell. Now, we laugh, but we laugh uncomfortably, don't we? Because that little girl has a sense already as a 5th grader that there is an inherent conflict. And these kinds of issues come with college students to the university very often. For example, take a former student of mine named Jeremy. Jeremy's now working on his PhD in plant sciences at the University of Texas, Austin. Jeremy came to me because I direct a course sequence that he was a part of at the university. And he said, well, I understand you're a Christian. I noticed your hard drive was named Narnia, so you must like C.S. Lewis. And I just wanted to talk to you about a few things. And he came to me and told me a story about how his faith had nearly been obliterated. Raised in a conservative home, he came to the university. He saw what scientists were saying, and he sensed that many of them didn't have a particular bone to pick. And he felt that what they were telling him made some sense. But he couldn't integrate it with his worldview that he came to the university with. For him, it was a choice of either science or his Christian faith. Jeremy was very close to jettisoning everything that he had learned about. And so we talked over a period of many weeks and months. We went through some readings together. We had lots of ongoing conversation. Ultimately, Jeremy was convinced, you can be a Christian and a scientist. But his faith was almost lost. It's those kinds of issues that motivate what we're about today and what I'm about in this session the rest of the way. And I'm going to try to use PowerPoint. We call it the bat cave up here because of these screens, but we'll give it a try. And I've got a little visual aid over off to the left here because we need to talk about some things that are fairly technical. I'll try not to overwhelm you. But we need to first try to understand, well, what exactly is science? Then we want to try to understand, with that understanding, what does the Bible seem to say about nature? And John has already touched on that very beautifully from the Old Testament perspective. And then we'll go on and talk about ways that Christians have thought about science. First, we'll see that biblical worldview provides a great context for doing science. And then we'll go on and talk about ways that other people have thought about this interface that really don't square with what the Bible seems to say about nature. And then finally, what we'll end up doing is talking about what difference does it make to a person who is a scientist that they're a Christian believer. So that's where we're headed today, and let's get started. Now, let's see. Mark, do I have to aim this thing? Oh, yeah, that's right. He's got a little thing hanging on the wall over there. Okay. All right, so let's talk about science in a hopelessly superficial way. And let's start with a dictionary definition. So here's the American Heritage Dictionary definition of science. It even phonetically spells it for you. Science is the observation, identification, description, and experimental investigation and theoretical explanation of phenomena. Okay. Now, some people want to restrict that to activities that are a class of natural phenomena. And there's a lot of debate about that, particularly in the intelligent design movement, which Wayne may touch on in his talk. It also applies to activities that involve the object of inquiry or study. And I love this. It's a methodological activity or discipline. Example, I've got packing a suitcase down to a science. Yeah, that's great. So science is a disciplined way of thinking about something. We know that. And in most cases, we're going to talk about natural science, and that's thinking about the natural world in a disciplined way. So now I have to say that most dictionary definitions are about 30 years out of date relative to what's going on with philosophy of science. We can't talk about very much of that except to say that there's a very nice book by Del Ratch on the book table called Science and Its Limits, which goes through in a very readable way some of the current thinking about philosophy of science. Let's just say that most philosophers of science would agree that there are three big principles that underlie science. First of all, there's data. It's empirical data. We have to study the world. We have methods for doing that. That data tells us something that we have to integrate in a coherent fashion. And the way we integrate that is through theories. These are explanatory frameworks that can be accessed and compared against the data. So we can assess these theories, see whether they match up with the data. Some theories are better than others. Finally, though, are what Del Ratch, and I think is a helpful term, called shaping concepts, shaping principles. And what Del Ratch means by this is that these are auxiliary concepts, ideas you need to do science, things that make science possible. And they're also sort of auxiliary things that define what a good theory is. So data, theories, shaping principles. And what sorts of shaping principles are we talking about here? These will be helpful when as we go along a little later. First of all, we can make sense of nature. It's intelligible. We can learn something about it and communicate that. And intelligibility requires certain things if you stop to think about it. Nature has to be regular. Our brains... Well, we learned our brains are down here, didn't we? So at least in the Old Testament view, I'm a New Testament person, so I'll go up here. That our brains tell us something informative about the world. So the rationality of thought process is something we take for granted, don't we? And we take other things for granted, like the linearity of time. We don't get caught in some temporal loop now and then. And nature is very orderly. Most scientists are what we call critical realists. Nobody's ever actually seen subatomic particles, but we believe that they exist and that they are real. And so in that sense, scientists may not have direct access to what's going on in the world, but there's a real world out there, and our theories are telling us something, maybe indirectly, in principle, about the real world that's out there, and our theories can in principle be true. And finally, another shaping principle are values. The values of doing science. For example, telling truth is essential in science. If we had a bunch of liars out there doing science on a daily basis, chaos would reign. This would not be a good situation. Sometimes there are other values, like simple theories are better than really complicated ones. So that's the so-called Occam's razor thing you may have heard about somewhere along the line. And some people think beautiful theories, maybe they're better than ugly ones somehow. And mathematicians and physicists are very fond of that one in particular. So these are all things that are going on behind the scenes with science. Now, I have to say that, well, Dennis Alexander puts it this way. He's an immunologist at Cambridge. You know, the philosophy of science is not much good day to day for a person who is a scientist. And, you know, he says, look, you can be a perfectly respectable bird without knowing anything about ornithology. You don't have to know about the underpinnings of science to do it. And I have to say the average scientist on the street is woefully out of touch with philosophy. So there must be something you can do as a scientist that goes into this description as well. We said that science is a discipline. In fact, people who practice science are smart. In general, I'm maybe not quite as smart as many scientists, but most of them are well trained, they have lots of degrees, and they have a methodology that allows them to study their discipline. Now, in addition, their methods are subject to external verification. If I use your same methods, I can get the same results as you did. If I have access to your data set, I can come to some of the same conclusions that you do. So there's an external verification aspect to that. In fact, scientists' work is peer-reviewed, so that scientists have to be committed to really studying what is, and the methods of science help, at least in part, but not always, that's for sure, to encourage that. Well, science also seeks natural explanations. And John already talked about that in his talk. Now, that doesn't imply something that's a full-blown worldview that we'll talk about called metaphysical naturalism. It just means that scientists are seeking natural explanations for phenomena out there in the world. And they want to do that whenever they can. And finally, we've already talked about this fact that science is empirical. It studies the way the world actually is, not how we wish it were or how our preconceptions tell us it ought to be. And that's an important kind of characteristic of science. So these are things that are true of science. And I have to say, in terms of what scientists do on a daily basis, yeah, we measure things a lot. We have fancy instruments. We have lab notebooks for recording our observations. And we publish our papers. We do all of those kinds of things. And that's certainly a feature of what we do that would make it distinct from systematic studying of a fishing hole, for example, by a fisherman. They're doing some of the things that scientists do, but not all of them. So those are some characteristics of science that we have to consider. Now, I have to say, there are a few other things that sometimes cause trouble, as we'll see. First of all, scientists use methodological reductionism. Now, what do I mean by that? It means it's kind of the car mechanic approach. You know, certain car mechanics think the best way to understand a car engine is to rip it apart into its component pieces. And that tells you an awful lot about a car engine. It doesn't tell you everything, as we'll see, but it tells you a lot. It's often provisional. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is that scientists realize that their theories have room for improvement in many situations. And so in many cases, science is progressing towards better explanations, not necessarily the best explanations by any means. Now, having said that, there are certain facts I think everybody agrees on. I'm a biologist. I think everyone agrees that for average eukaryotic organisms, DNA is the genetic material. That is a fact. And it was arrived at through science. So there are certain theories that are so well attested that they have this kind of really hard status. Finally, just because a theory is incomplete doesn't mean that the data that the theory is trying to explain don't exist or are somehow wrong. So, for example, scientists disagree ultimately about the nature of gravity. In fact, we don't have a very good explanation for how to unite Einstein's theory of general relativity with quantum mechanics. But we'd be foolish to suspect that because we don't have a good explanation for that if I drop this book, it's not going to fall to the ground. So there are phenomena, and then there are theories. And sometimes confusing these two is not helpful. Just because we don't have a good theory doesn't mean that the data are incorrect. So that in a nutshell, and people who know a lot about this are cringing right now. That's in a nutshell what we mean by science. So let's look at what the Bible has to say about some of this. And John has already introduced this subject. What I want to focus on here is God's ongoing activity in nature. John's talked to you about origins issues in Genesis 1 and how one might interpret that in terms of function rather than mechanism. And we want to kind of add to that a little bit. And to do that, let's talk about Psalm 19. Psalm 19. Psalm 19 has two major parts, verses 1 through 6. Look at how we learn about what God is up to through nature. Verses 7 through 14 talk about how we learn about God through his word. And this metaphor of two books, the book of God's works in nature and the book of God's word in the Bible, has served many scientists who are Christians well throughout the centuries. And let's take a look at Psalm 19. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they display knowledge. There is no speech or language where their voice is not heard. Their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world. In the heavens, he's pitched a tent for the sun, which is like a bridegroom coming forth from his pavilion, like a champion rejoicing to run his course. It rises at one end of the heavens and makes its circuit to the other. Nothing is hidden from its heat. So this is very poetic language, and yet the psalmist is describing something very fundamental for us as Christians, or at least for me as a Christian thinking about science. And that is that God's world tells us something about the reliability of the Creator. And Francis Bacon said it this way. Francis Bacon, the father of the inductive method, which has some serious problems but was an important development in modern science, said it this way: "Let no man think or maintain that a man can search too far or be too well studied in the book of God's word or in the book of God's works." Now, interestingly, that quote is on the front piece of Charles Darwin's Origin of Species. You may not know that. Pretty interesting factoid. Right. Now, what does the Bible say about nature based on what we just read in Psalm 19? Well, let's talk about that. First of all, nature's reliable. The reliability of natural processes, in fact, reflects something about God's character. God set it up, and it testifies to his glory. Secondly, God set it up the way he wanted to. So in some sense, nature's particular. It's a particular work of art, if you will. And as John's already told you, the scriptures, especially the Old Testament scriptures, but also the New Testament scriptures, focus on function of nature, its relationship to God, and the meaning of nature as a created piece of work, not the mechanisms that underlie it. So that's what the Bible says about nature. And moreover, we can infer a few things. First of all, as John said, nature is not pantheistic. There are not spirits inhabiting individual objects. The creation is separate from its creator. But creation is not closed either. It's not a closed system. No, God is the creator, and he can interact with his creation however he wants. So in this sense, Donald Carson, in his book, The Gagging of God, I think, uses the term controlled creation, and I like that very much. Normally, the creation runs through the God-given potentialities that it has, but God is free because he is its creator to interact with it if he wants to. In fact, Psalm 105, which we won't talk about today, is a brilliant description of the historical intervention of God in the history of his people. So the scriptures clearly say that nature is something that God is about, but also he can intervene in it. All right. So, in fact, what that means is that natural laws don't govern anything. From the biblical perspective, there are no natural laws. Natural laws don't govern the universe. No. God governs the universe. And we need to keep that straight. All right, so that's what Psalm 19 says. And let's think about what this is telling us. Well, first of all, because God is the author of his works and his word, those two pieces of information cannot ultimately be in conflict. And several people have generated charts like this, including a friend of mine, Craig Rusbold, who's here today. And these kinds of charts are helpful for thinking about this. Those two books can't be in conflict. Our interpretations of them can. So God is the author of nature. He's the author of Scripture. But ultimately, those two have to necessarily be in agreement because God is the author of both. Now, as for our human interpretations, that's a different story. Science and philosophy interpret the natural world, and our interpretations are likely flawed. Theology, philosophy, the interpretive enterprise, something that John talked about in his talk, those are flawed as well. And so as we look at God's word, our understanding of it can lead to potential conflicts with our understanding of nature, but these are sort of second-order conflicts. At the end of the day, God is the author of both, and in his mind, there is no conflict. Well, we can say that from Psalm 19, but one other thing that's true there we can infer is that the passage of the heavenly bodies is a reliable event, and that happens every day, doesn't it? When you got up this morning, depending on when you got up, the sun was already up or it was on its way up. Those are continual processes, and in fact, scriptures make clear that initial creation is not the end of the story. God continually sustains his creation. So take a look at Colossians 1, for example, where the Apostle Paul says this. For by him, this is Jesus in this case, all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible, invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things were created by him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Notice what Paul says here. God creates the universe, past tense, but notice in verse 17 what's going on. In verse 17, all things hold together in him. That verb tense is present tense. So whatever God is doing is extending to the present moment. And in fact, the theologian Augustine said it this way. Creation is, or nature is, what God does. And John already talked to you about this conception. And Paul shares this same idea with the Old Testament, as John already told you about. Well, the writer to the book of Hebrews says it this way. But in these last days, he's spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom he made the universe. That's past tense again. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being. We don't have time to unpack that. Sustaining all things by his powerful word. Present tense again, see that? So what this implies then is that God, moment by moment, is involved in natural processes. They accomplish his purposes. And you can really see that here. Here's Psalm 104. At least a piece of it. Psalm 104 is sometimes called the biologist psalm, but it's really the geologists and the atmospheric scientist psalm too, because it talks about all aspects of nature. But I'll go to the biology part because I'm a biologist. Here are verses 19 through 21. The moon marks off the seasons, and the sun knows when to go down. So somehow they have an inherent ability to do that. You, God, Yahweh, bring darkness. It becomes night, and all the beasts of the forest prowl. The lions roar for their prey and seek their food from God. That's interesting. I thought lions just went out and ate things when they hunted. But somehow the psalmist attributes that to something that is part of God's activity, doesn't he? Directly here. In the same way, the moon and the other celestial objects, they can do what they do on their own, but look what it says at the beginning of verse 20. You, God, bring darkness. So somehow God's intentions are fused with natural processes much of the time. And that includes random processes. How about this one? Proverbs 16:33. The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. Now, I'm not suggesting you go out to a local convenience store and play the scratch and win game anytime soon, although you could. But what this says is that seemingly random processes are part of God's governing of the world. Now, random here, we have to say, random doesn't mean without purpose. It just means a probabilistic kind of event, like casting lots, that humans can't predict the outcome of. And so that encompasses a number of things. For example, random mutations have been proposed to be a mechanism for generating biological diversity. Quantum mechanics has a built-in randomness to it in some sense. God is in control of all of that in ways that we cannot understand. And theologians call that providence. God providentially uses natural processes to accomplish his purposes. And the sum and substance of this is that we can be confident as Christians that studying the natural world is of value because we're studying part of God's purposes for his creation. Now, here's the famous pie versus cake diagram. Now, you had a lot of discussion about this. This is actually from John's undergraduate textbook. And I just want to remind you that this kind of view, what I'm talking about, really fits better with that cake model. That the whole cake is God's. We don't slice up pieces of it and look for God's intervention specifically in certain areas and assume that when there's a natural process, he's not involved. That's simply not correct. All right, so where does this get us? Well, let's think about those characteristics of science that I talked about earlier, particularly their shaping principles. I think this biblical worldview is really helpful. First of all, natural events have natural causes. That's what science says. And we've already said creation's not pantheistic. It runs on its own. Science assumes a linear view of time, so does the Bible. Causes and effects have regular patterns. From a biblical perspective, we'd say that God is not capricious. His natural creation has a certain integrity to it that makes it consistent, although he can intervene, as we've said. Science says we can understand those patterns. In the biblical worldview, we're made in God's image, which allows us to understand what God is doing in his world. Science says experiments are needed. The Bible says God's creativity is free, so we have to investigate it to understand what he was up to. Moreover, we are fallen creatures, so our inherent understanding is limited, and we need other methods to engage in understanding the world. And finally, scientists certainly think science is worth doing. And from a biblical perspective, nature is God's creation, and we're called to study it. So you see how these worldviews fit very nicely together. Now, in fact, I have to say, historically, many people who were Christian believers have been outstanding scientists. This may be overstated, but Melvin Calvin, who himself is not a Christian, he's a Nobel laureate for his work on photosynthesis, the Calvin-Benson cycle if you're an undergraduate taking biology. Well, he said it this way: as I try to discern the origin of that conviction that the world is an understandable place, I seem to find it in a basic notion discovered 2,000 or 3,000 years ago and enunciated in the Western world by the Hebrews, namely, that the universe is governed by a single God. And this monotheistic view seems to be the historical foundation for modern science. Johannes Kepler was thinking God's thoughts after him when he discovered the laws of planetary motion. Isaac Newton wrote biblical commentaries in addition to doing his work on gravitation. James Clerk Maxwell, Michael Faraday, 19th century physicists, devout believers, and the list goes on and on. Including this guy, Francis Collins, and we have his book available for sale. Here's what he said, and he's a key scientist in the Human Genome Project. The work of a scientist involved in this project, particularly a scientist who has the joy of also being a Christian, is a work of discovery, which can also be a form of worship. To have the chance to see the glory of creation, the intricacy of it, the beauty of it, is really an experience not to be matched. And you know, I'm a scientist as well, and I can say the same thing. In fact, when I see an embryo in its early phases of development and its cells migrating and doing the amazingly orchestrated series of processes that give rise to a complicated animal from a fertilized egg, that rocks. You know, I love that stuff. And in fact, I've been thinking this way for a long time. Now, my wife Susie's had to put up with this for a very long time as well. And in fact, what you see here hangs in our little kitchenette area. This is a letter that I wrote to my wife when she was my fiance while I was still in seminary before I went back for my PhD at UC Berkeley. Now, it's printed on Michigan State University cyclotron laboratory paper. And on the top it says levels of complexity. And on the upper left it starts with quarks, which are subatomic particles we can't see. They're held together by gluons. And then it goes up to subatomic particles, things like components of the nucleus, and then you've got electrons flying around those nuclei, you've got atoms. Then it moves to molecules. And we have synthesis of organic molecules here if you're a biologist. Ultimately we have things like DNA and protein here. We move over to cells at the middle on the right. Tissues, organs. Ultimately, there's a picture of me here with my shoe size indicated and my wife, and then beautiful music and a little wedding ring pictured down here on the lower right. I should have said one of the characteristics of science is that many scientists are inherently incredibly nerdy, and that's what you see there. But you know, I was fired up about nature because I'm discovering the handiwork of God through that. And that's carried through to this day for me. All right, now, there's a problem, I have to say. Given this, you would think, well, where is the problem? There doesn't seem to be a problem. However, when we look at other people's responses to faith and nature, we get very different kinds of approaches. People who aren't Christians can say things like this. Here's Carl Sagan. The cosmos is all there is or ever was or ever will be. Very famous statement from a public television series decades ago. Richard Dawkins. We are machines built by DNA whose purpose is to make more copies of the same DNA. That is exactly what we are for. He gave that lecture on Christmas, by the way. Finally, Dawkins again. Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. That's what he says in his book, The Blind Watchmaker. So somehow they're coming to a different conclusion, aren't they? Let's talk about that. What's going on here? Well, first of all, it's pretty clear from those statements, this is not about seeking natural explanations. Come on, let's call it what it is. This is about elevating nature to a worldview of metaphysical naturalism. Nature is all there is, get over it. That's it. And it tends to reflect metaphysical reductionism as well. All we are vessels for carrying DNA. That's a reductionist statement. Whoa. What's going on here? Well, I think Thomas Nagel, a philosopher, put it really well. Here's what he said. And you don't have this quote, but just listen to this. I want atheism to be true. I'm made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God. My guess is that this cosmic authority problem is not a rare condition and that's responsible for much of the scientism and reductionism of our time. One of the tendencies it supports is the ludicrous overuse of evolutionary biology to explain everything about life. Who might he have been referring to there? Not sure. Maybe Richard Dawkins. Now, I think Nagel's hit the nail on the head. And we need to unmask those statements when we see them. Now, I think this conflict thesis fails on a number of counts. First of all, historically it fails. We've already talked about that briefly. Colin Russell, a historian of science, says, this conflict deal, it makes for good drama, but bad history. Makes for good drama, but bad history. So there is no real conflict historically between scientists and faith. There have been conflicts, but it's not an unbroken record of conflict by any means, as I've already said. Moreover, we can say that when we see this kind of thing, we need to unmask it for what it is. Now, there are other problems here. First of all, this kind of view fails to take into account the limits of science. Sir Peter Medawar said it this way: the existence of a limit to science is made clear by its inability to answer childlike questions like, how did everything begin? What are we all here for? What's the point of living? It's not to science, but to metaphysics, imaginative literature, or religion that we must turn for answers to questions having to do with first and last things. See, Dawkins has forgotten that science is limited, and this is one of its limits. In addition, this kind of worldview fails to understand why the universe is just the way it is and why it exists at all. Martin Rees, who's a very famous astronomer from Cambridge, said, the preeminent mystery is why anything exists at all. What breathes life into the equations and actualize them in a real cosmos. And such questions are beyond science. Beyond science. Moreover, how do we know that those shaping principles are true? Why do we trust in the regularity of nature? Well, C.S. Lewis asked that same question. If all that exists is nature, the great, mindless, interlocking event, there's not the slightest ground for supposing that our sense of fitness and our consequent faith in uniformity tell us anything about a reality external to ourselves. If naturalism's true, we have no reason to trust our conviction that nature is uniform. It's one of those shaping principles. Christianity, I think, has a good explanation for why that's true. Albert Einstein said something similar. I found no better expression than, quote, religious, unquote, for the confidence in the rational nature of reality. Whenever this feeling is absent, science degenerates into uninspired empiricism. Oh, I like that. See, science is limited. It relies on other principles for its operation, and they seem to have forgotten this. All right, now, I've used this textbook already in a very disrespectful way, I must say. But this is a textbook that Wayne Becker, who you'll hear from next, and I are co-authors on. It's called The World of the Cell. Now, this is, first of all, I have to say we have the most imaginative covers, Wayne, wouldn't you agree, of any cell biology text on the market today on the planet. So there's actually art on the cover. But Wayne has been an author of this book for many, many years. And when he was in the initial negotiations for the first edition of this book with various textbook publishers, he had a very interesting exchange that he gave me permission to share with you all. When we see this kind of thinking afoot, we need to unmask it for what it is. And Wayne did that in a letter, and he recounts his experience here. The editor had written a bunch of descriptions about what they wanted in this book that he was thinking about writing, and one of the sections was on the origin of life. And there the editor said, topics to be discussed: cosmology, formation of the earth, primeval soup, first cells. This is usually far too briefly discussed, if at all. And goes on and talks about a few other things. And then at the end of this paragraph, the editor says this: this discussion could also make clear why God is an unnecessary hypothesis. Wayne, he describes his letter as equally rambling, apparently, compared to what the editor had written him, and concludes on page 4 of his letter with this. He says, now, okay, I want to point out Wayne is one of the most humble, gentle men that I've ever known at the university, but he's doing what I'm suggesting. One final point, though. I find myself profoundly disturbed by the comment under item B4 that, quote, this discussion could also make clear why God is an unnecessary hypothesis, unquote. A biology text has a responsibility to present and summarize our current understanding on possible explanations concerning the origin and evolution of life forms, and I would attempt to seriously do so. It has, in my opinion, no right whatever to theological pronouncements which are purported to derive from such a discussion. You might, by the way, wish to consider the appropriateness of a note of praise that God, in his infinite wisdom and patience, has not yet seen fit to declare you an unnecessary hypothesis. But Wayne is just calling a spade, and we need to do the same. Because if we don't do that, then we can have the Richard Dawkinses of the world tell us something that isn't true. All right, now let's go back to this concept that Dawkins is evincing about, we're just carriers, we're DNA carriers, that's all we are. This is an example of hyper-reductionism. That's another error that's often made here. Let me suggest why reductionism fails and why people who are tempted to do this are barking up the wrong tree. How many people have been to the Art Institute of Chicago? A few people. Have you seen this painting there? Yeah, this is Sunday afternoon on the island of Le Grand Jet by Georges Seurat. Prime example of a technique called pointillism, sort of a post-impressionist technique. This is a huge painting, gigantic, wonderful, wonderful thing. In fact, I have a little copy of it if you want to look at it later. Well, pointillism involves placing very fine brushstrokes and little dots all over the canvas. And you can't really see the pointillistic effect until your nose is very close to the canvas. Reductionism kind of takes this approach. And scientists like to do this as a method. So they might take this painting, and they might zoom in on that little yellow square there at the border between the light and the shade above the dog. All right? But a scientist would go, so they might zoom in, and so that's what you see if you zoom in on that little square. There's a light and a dark shade. And you notice, oh, that's interesting. There's lots of little brush strokes there. Maybe if I zoom in, I can learn something more. Oh, look at that. There's like little globby things when I get my face right up to it. And in fact, people have studied every inch of this canvas to look at how Seurat applied these little dots. Scientists are usually working at this level. Is it an important thing to understand how those dots were applied? Yes. Without the application of those dots, would there be a painting by Seurat hanging in the Art Institute? No, clearly not. Does this exhaust the explanation of the painting? Obviously not. The painting is a painting. It's not simply a place where dots have been applied. It has higher levels of meaning and organization that mean that if all we say is that this is what the painting consists of, we're sadly mistaken. And reductionists usually make that same mistake, including Dawkins and other people like P.W. Atkins and lots of people. Well, if those approaches fail, what are some other strategies? Well, Stephen Jay Gould has a strategy of compartmentalization. Now, let's just stay out of each other's way. And he calls those the non-overlapping magisteria of science and religion. The net or magisterium of science covers the empirical realm. We said science is empirical. The magisterium of religion extends over questions of ultimate meaning and moral value. Sounds good. These two magisteria do not overlap. To cite the old cliches, science gets the age of rocks, religion, the rock of ages. Science studies how the heavens go, religion, how to go to heaven. It all sounds so simple, doesn't it? But what kind of thinking is that? That's pie thinking, isn't it? We're going to slice up the pie, and the pieces of pie just won't ooze on one another. That's what we'd like to say. Well, another approach is Deism. God wound up the universe, but, he's kind of left the scene. And Stephen Hawking is certainly no deist, I would say, but he espouses this view very well in his book, A Brief History of Time. These laws have originally been decreed by God, but it appears that he since left the universe to evolve according to them and does not now intervene in it. That's a nice way of keeping science and religion out of one another's hair. But that fails too, because it doesn't square with that biblical worldview. So those are probably not good options for us. What are some options for us? Well, Wayne is going to talk about specific ways to cash out these options, but let me suggest a couple of ways to think about this. One is complementarity. The bottom layer of the cake, in John's terminology, that's science. The top layer, which sometimes drills down all the way to the bottom, that's supernatural activity of God. Both are his activities, though. And that means that the creation can be considered from multiple perspectives simultaneously. They're not mutually exclusive. I can study the dots on Seurat's painting quite nicely, thank you, but there are other levels of meaning there. And it takes that cake approach seriously. So, for example, we can think about science coming from the bottom up. Science are those little dots, and they tell us something important for sure. Theology and what the Bible has to say, that's kind of a top-down approach to thinking about creation. Theology gives us the big picture and provides a context of meaning for science. So that leaves us with, I think, what are some biblical ideas about this controlled creation. And I want to say, sincere Christians disagree on to what extent God intervenes supernaturally versus naturally, and Wayne will talk much more about that. However, they do tend to favor either lots of intervention or more frequent intervention, or they don't like the idea of intervention. So I'll use the terms interventionist and non-interventionist to refer to them. That may or may not be helpful. I'm not sure. Wayne will give you a very nice spectrum of views along these lines. So interventionist models where God erupts into history in its formational history to do things periodically, that involves supernatural intervention. And there's some real upsides to that. It seeks to take Scripture really seriously as a source for integration fact, information about natural process. It seeks to identify evidence for God's creation through intelligent design. At least one part of the intelligent design argument, as Wayne will tell you. People don't like this view. Well, what are some cons? Well, it may lead to interpretations, as John mentioned, that are problematic with regard to the biblical text. Potential problem. And it does tend, some forms of this tend to that pie situation. And John talked about this God of the gaps idea. But it need not lead there, and it doesn't logically exclude a desire to avoid these gaps in no way can logically exclude God's intervention. Non-interventionists, for example, one of the authors of one of the chapters in one of the books on the book table, Howard Van Til, likes to think of nature as being robust in its ability to do everything on its own because God made it in such an amazingly cool way, it can do everything it needs to. And so in this view, God doesn't interrupt in formational history, but he does interrupt in salvation history. God most certainly performed miraculous interventions, and this would be along the lines of what John talked about in his talk. And so these views have a high view of God's creation and his sustenance of creation moment by moment. And I think this encourages us to aim high as scientists, and John sort of alluded to that. But there are pros and cons to both of these positions from any number of perspectives. All right, now Wayne will talk a lot more about these positions as in his talk. But what I want to end on is, what difference does this all make? We've seen that science has certain ways of doing things. The biblical worldview is compatible with those ways of doing things. We've also seen that despite all of that evidence, people want to smuggle metaphysical naturalism as a worldview into using science to sort of as a bludgeon, if you will, but that fails. We've also seen that ways of carving up that pie, probably not a good idea from a biblical perspective, and we've at least sketched out some ways to think about those. But there's another place where faith enters in, and that is as a person who is a scientist. Scientists are not just automatons gathering data. They are human beings, fully integrated, at least in a few cases that I've seen. And so let's think about that. What difference does that make? Well, first of all, I think the biblical worldview finds a locus for the intelligibility of the world. We can make sense of the world because God made it, and that fits nicely with my faith. Secondly, I think it makes sense of the unique conditions leading to the world, the fine-tuning of the universe that Wayne will allude to when he talks about intelligent design, and its particular operating principles make sense from this perspective. And as Rick and Stuart will tell you, it provides an ethical basis for the practice of science, particularly in applied areas. And they'll talk more about that after lunch. But it also does something else. It provides meaning for the individual who is a scientist. Why is this an issue? Well, listen to George Gaylord Simpson, a paleontologist in the 20th century. In his view, man was certainly not the goal of evolution, which evidently had no goal. Now, he really meant that it was not a directed process as a scientific event, but he does tend to say the following. He was not planned in an operation wholly planless. Now, that's not talking about science anymore. Others who have not shared the biblical worldview have espoused similar wistful thinking. So, for example, Steven Weinberg, Nobel laureate for his work on the electroweak theory in elementary particle physics. The more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it seems pointless. But if there's no solace in the fruits of our research, there's at least some consolation in the research itself. The effort to understand the universe is one of the things that lifts human life a little above the level of farce and gives it the grace of tragedy. He said that in a book called The First 3 Minutes. Now, he was heavily criticized by his colleagues for saying this because he was being honest. He was being vulnerable. And in a subsequent book, he wrote about his encounters after this. In his book, Dreams of a Final Theory, he said this. Now, my favorite response was from my colleague at the University of Texas. He thought my remark was, quote, nostalgic, unquote. Indeed, it was. Nostalgic for a world in which the heavens declared the glory of God. That's a quote an allusion directly to Psalm 19. Psalm 19. Now, Weinberg has no hope of finding such a world, but we do. In the Christian worldview, that's exactly the world that we have, but it's supplemented by something amazing. That's that second book at the end of Psalm 19. So if we look at Psalm 19, verses 7 through 14, it says, "The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The statutes of the Lord are trustworthy, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, giving joy to the heart. The commands of the Lord are radiant, giving light to the eyes. The fear of the Lord is pure, enduring forever. Who can discern his errors?" It's a rhetorical question. No one can. We need God's word to show us that. "Forgive my hidden faults. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer." You see, this is where we get meaning from, the meaning that allows us to do science and to find joy in the experimental enterprise. And it's the meaning that Weinberg wistfully wishes that he had. But we do as Christians, and that's what makes being a scientist and a Christian incredibly meaningful. Now let's go back one more time to Georges Seurat. Now imagine, this is the painting. We've learned that reductionism doesn't fully understand this painting. But we have another level of meaning even beyond the whole canvas hanging in the Art Institute. Imagine we could transport ourselves back to the 19th century and, wow, talk to Georges. Imagine we could do that. Would we gain even deeper insight into the meaning of his whole canvas? You bet we would. That's exactly what we can do. That second book allows us to do just that. We can talk to the God of the universe and find an incredible context for doing natural science. And in fact, many people have realized that science and Christianity can in fact be friends. The doors of the Cavendish laboratories in Cambridge, England, where a lot of important work in elementary particle physics was done at the turn of the 20th century, had inscribed in Latin a quote from the Psalms. And it's from Psalm 111, verse 2. It says, "Great are the works of Yahweh, the Lord. They are pondered by all who delight in them." And we can say exactly that same thing. Thank you very much.